Now, I've talked about issues with fertility before, and personally, I'm not sure whether or not it's an actual crisis. I'll leave that to people who are more certain about things, either in one direction or the other. But today, I want to talk about some of the causes of the so-called fertility crisis. This assumes that it's a big problem, of course, which I'm on the fence on. But regardless, if it is in fact a problem, what is causing it? And a lot of people have obviously weighed in on this, and I guess I'll be the 11th gazillionth person to do so. But I've done some research on my own. I've looked into things, and I've come to certain conclusions about various things. Now, one thing I won't be offering in this video is solutions. Well, who does, after all? Because the fertility problem, as we'll discover, is a pretty intractable issue. It's a bit like being poor, right? Everyone could just say, well, the way to fix poverty is to not be poor, to make money, to have money. But that's oftentimes easier said than done. And the same applies here. So essentially, after what I've looked into, after a period of time, the fertility crisis can be broken down into two principal components. You have a broad generalized factor, which may be causative, it may be correlative, I'm not sure. And then you have specifics. And by that I mean a broad general economic factor, as well as a factor that I think you could relate to cognitive ability as well as personality traits that is feeding into this issue. And I'll talk about that as well. For example, why is South Korea the country with the lowest fertility rate? Well, it's not just the broad general principle that I'll be talking about, which also applies in South Korea, make no mistake about that, but also local issues. Okay, what is the underlying issue? Well, people like to dismiss this, but I do think it's fundamentally an economic issue. But just saying it's an economic issue doesn't really describe the problem or the details at all, now does it? Because what I've done recently is have a look at a number of statistics, a number of graphs, and usually what you see is the issue of low fertility primarily affects those we deem the middle class. It almost doesn't affect at all poor people, and it hardly affects very wealthy people. Now, this requires a little bit of unraveling, obviously. So we've all noticed that poor people, on average, people who are of lesser financial means, for whatever reason, don't seem terribly bothered about having multiple children at times. The classic instance of this might be the British chav. I'm sure you're familiar with it, and if not, if you're not from the British Isles, then chav culture is a kind of low-class, low-brow culture that is endemic to the British Isles, and they typically have children at very young ages. There was a story a while back about a particular chav family in which the mother became a grandmother at age 26, so you get the gist. Very fecund people, and people, as a rule, that have children relatively young without a care for the future. They are not suffering from below fertility, as far as I can tell. This is just one instance of it, but I think it's illustrative of the phenomenon. That's why I mention it. Well, why is that? Well, on average, if we're going to make certain assumptions, and I think there's good evidence for this, on average, not always, poor people have lower impulse control, and on average, we'll put it euphemistically, they are somewhat cognitively impaired compared to other groups of people that are not exactly in the same socioeconomic status. Now, this isn't a perfect one-to-one. All the caveats apply, but on average, yes, on average, people who are poor tend to have lower impulse control, and typically they're also not the sharpest tools in the shed. There are lots of other issues that affect it, yes, but we're talking about averages and correlations. Okay. Now, if you're low impulse control and you're somewhat cognitively impaired, you're probably not going to care very much about the consequences of having children, no matter how many children you have. Hell, in the instance I cited, we were talking about the repeat occurrence of both the daughter and the mother who had children at age 13, right? So amazing. 13, the mother has a child. 13 years later, she becomes a grandmother because her own daughter had a child. And don't forget things like genetic selection effect here, that there's a certain phenotype in terms of the behavior and psychology that produces this effect. So, yes, poor people on average, people in this socioeconomic bracket, are not super concerned with the future. They're not planning for 20 years down the line, etc., etc. At the other end of the spectrum, you have very wealthy people. Now, wealthy people, with all the caveats, on average, yes, are generally speaking highly conscientious, generally speaking above average in cognitive capacity, and on average, of course, this leads to greater wealth, because again, all these factors that lead to wealth are heritable, and they have lots of money. Now, if you're a person who's concerned about the future, but you have lots of money to cover all the bases, well, you're going to be less concerned about having children. Amongst the very wealthy, they are typically, from what I've looked at, depending on the country, but on average not really below replacement. They usually have 2 children or what have you. I think the most extreme example of this, and this is obviously just an anecdote, is Elon Musk, who the gods only know has something like 12 children. He's a multi-billionaire. Of course, he's not worried about not being able to finance his children. He has plenty of money in the bank, so to speak. But most people are not poor, nor are they rich. They fall somewhere in the middle. They fall into what we at least used to call the middle class, a broad swath of people that cover a lot of bases, because they're people who are middle class through various factors manage to make it to middle class despite having many attributes that might overlap with the typical poor person. And likewise, there are people that are hyper intelligent and hyper conscientious that despite these qualities never manage to become filthy rich or very wealthy. So you get a whole bunch of different people thrown into this mix. But on average, we can assume that they're probably not terribly dumb. They probably at least above average intelligence. They probably have at least above average impulse control, or enough such that they're not bankrupting themselves constantly. And here we see where the economic factors really come into play, because if you are poor and have low impulse control and not the most amazing cognitive ability, you're not concerned with the future, money doesn't matter, at least nominally, not in your head. It doesn't matter very much. If you are conversely smart and have high impulse control, but have tons of money, you don't need to worry about covering the costs of having children, etc., etc. But what happens, say, if you have a 120 IQ and you have somewhat above average impulse control, and on top of that, you're fairly conscientious? You're not the smartest cookie, but you're pretty damn smart. You're doing okay. What happens in such a case when you get a bunch of these people trying to make decisions about reproduction? Well, they have to combine incomes, they have to consider these things, but children are damn expensive, especially in a place like the U.S. where you have to consider things such as higher education and the absolutely ridiculous, incomprehensible costs associated with it, which usually involve going to debt if you're not filthy rich. What do people like that do? Smart people with some impulse control, they worry, they think about the consequences of what they're doing. Can they afford children? Now, many times, they probably could, but they would have to take a pay cut in terms of their lifestyle choices. So, for example, they might have to live in a smaller accommodation, or they might not be able to do as many things like take vacations or whatever as they're used to. And they're worried about the prospects of having a child or even 2 children and their ability to afford that, as well as coordinating their own personal interests in the world. And I'm really fairly convinced of this because I can see this having looked at stats in Europe and having looked at stats in the US and Canada and other places, that this is fairly consistent. It's not perfect, but it's fairly consistent. So you have this broad swath of people that are pretty concerned about these things because, frankly speaking, they have tons of money, and so they're worried about how much it all costs and their own ability to afford things that they either want or they think are necessary. These self-same people, by the way, if you were to take some guy who's 120 IQ, partner with a wife who's 120 IQ, both above average and conscientious, etc., and make them rich, I think these people would then start having children because the financial factor that they personally view as an obstacle or something to the very least consider is the thing standing in their way. Rich people don't need to worry about that, and poor people just don't worry about that. Okay, this is the broad factor informing this, in my view, having looked into this, that you could probably apply for the most part globally, certainly throughout the Occident. Throughout the Occident, you probably could apply this because it seems to be a pretty damning problem, and most people are somewhere in the middle. They're neither super poor nor are they super rich. Okay, now we come to specific cultural issues that affect it, which are local to specific countries. And we will start with ground zero. South Korea has a replacement level of, as of the making of this video, 0.78. It is by far the lowest in the entire world, beating out places even as famous as Japan. Why is this? Well, in addition to all the other concerns, because there are financial concerns here that I mentioned, there are cultural factors here that go back to the history of the country. South Korea, in the first half of the 20th century, was not doing well. And the peninsula was then, in the 1950s, sundered, quite literally sundered into twain by the Korean War, a battle of the forces of communism and freedom, as it were. At least that's what the propaganda would have you believe. Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't really matter. The point is that there's North Korea, and South Korea, sometime in the 60s and the 70s, really started developing quickly. They call this the miracle on the Han River. The Han River is the major river that runs through the capital, Seoul, and they just blew up economically, astonishingly. And they just blew up fantastically in the economic sense, and then almost overnight, at least by historical terms, turned into an economic superpower within a few short decades. By the 1980s, they were doing really, really well, and by the 90s, they were really, really taking off. And then fast forward to now, and every female below the age of 25 is somehow Koreaboo and thinks that life in South Korea is like a historical K-drama and that all the men look like K-pop stars. That's neither here nor there, maybe a topic for a separate video. But that came at a price. What you ended up getting in the case of South Korea as a consequence of this was a very specific version of the Mao's utopia experiment, because if you've ever been to Korean cities, they're hideous to behold. They're very unaesthetic. There are people just living on top of each other, clamped together. It's very unpleasant. So there's a kind of jitteriness to the place. And then you have work culture, which I think is a consequence of the miracle of the Han River, where these people are just working themselves to death. I lived in South Korea, as many of you know, for 2 years. And it's more important oftentimes to make commitments to your work, to the collective, right, the collective, than it is to your own family. When your boss says you need to drink until 3 a.m. on a Wednesday night, despite having to go to work tomorrow, you're going to do that. Because a culture such as Korean culture is all about saving face. Saving face in light of the fear of losing face, because it reflects upon everybody. So work-life balance in South Korea isn't even a thing on the table. It's not something you can negotiate. There are no incentives available for that. It's not arranged to make things like that work. Whereas in places like Denmark, which is doing the best in the West, something like 1.6, it very much is tailored to that sort of thing, being able to work a job, especially as a female. None of that is available in South Korea. And an obligation to a company is often something like a lifetime obligation. And because of the collectivistic nature of the society, they have to swear allegiance to that and oftentimes elevate those interests above their own or those of their families. It is a very common thing, sort of the Korean worker drone that just goes to work and is very uninvolved with his family, etc., etc. I've known many Koreans who were sired by such men. And the women, of course, it's somewhat more traditional, but it's a bit of a mixed bag because they're working more and more. And there's a whole separate discussion about how feminism is trying to make its way into South Korea, and there is a massive cultural conflict there as well. But basically in South Korea, you have an oppressive climate, one that demands conformity, one that demands fealty to the collective. On top of that, you have very boxed-in environments that prevent people from feeling at ease, and you have the economic demands that I mentioned in the beginning, such that South Korea needs to keep on performing these miracles upon the Han River in order to keep on going. This, in addition to all the economic things that I mentioned affecting the middle class, they also apply to South Korea, I believe. And the government has tried to offer incentives, tax incentives, paying people to have children. It doesn't really work. Now, theoretically, given what we know, assuming my hypothesis here is correct, if the government were to, say, wholesale finance children, pay, say, for accommodation, that's a big issue in South Korea because of the cluttered, close-knit cities and how they're structured and built, that people struggle to find affordable housing. It's not unique to South Korea, but it's particularly bad there. Imagine, say, if the government stepped and said, well, we'll pay for your housing. Would that make a difference? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the amount of faith that the people in question have in their respective government. So that's a cultural reason in South Korea. And of course, look, the U.S. is doing significantly better than South Korea in this regard. South Korea is 0.78, and the fertility rate in the U.S. is something like 1.64 per woman. So if you're concerned about the fertility crisis, it's not as concerning in the U.S., but nonetheless, fewer and fewer people seemingly want to have children. More than anywhere in the industrialized world, I think the arguments about economics, sort of the major general broad cause, applies to the United States. But there are other factors, too. And you can see, for example, people saying they don't want to lose their freedom. That's something that when you ask millennials about whether or not they have kids, or even Zoomers, they'll cite that. They want to keep their freedom. Now, this is almost certainly a cultural phenomenon, right? Because if you'd gone back 100 years to 1923 and asked people whether or not they want to have kids, and they said, oh, well, I don't want to inhibit my freedom, that would be culturally disapproved of. There was a social stigma to make such claims, probably. Now it's endorsed, encouraged, and even regarded as something positive. So it's a cultural phenomenon. The problem is that culture is not something you can just change with a snap of your fingers. It doesn't work that way. And finally, you can look at different cultures around the world that aren't doing terribly poorly. You look at, say, Orthodox Jews are pumping out kids nonstop, the Amish, etc., etc. So you can see with enough doctrine or dogma and being sufficiently insulated away from the world, or isolated might be a better way of putting it, you can affect certain changes in terms of fertility. But as we can see, this is not a problem you can simply solve overnight, and it's probably not a problem you could solve over a year, even 10 years. This is a consequence of many, many factors coming together and making it very difficult, I would argue, almost intractable, to solve this issue. Because when you look at the U.S., the mainstream culture, which is overwhelmingly left-wing and progressive, it is not a culture that particularly endorses fecundity, nor the so-called biblical mandate of going forth and multiplying. So on that front, in addition to the economic hindrances, you would need to restructure the culture from the ground up. And as we all know, wokeism is here to stay for quite some time. It's not going away anytime soon, and there will be long-standing consequences if my hypothesis at least is right on this. Now, this is a separate discussion from the idea of whether or not it's a terrible thing if fertility goes below a certain level. As I said, I'll leave that for people who are sure of themselves in that regard. But as always, thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons. You guys are the best. You keep the channel alive. And if you like my content and want to support it, please consider becoming a patron, or at the very least making a one-time or two-time donation on PayPal, links below. And if you engage in the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you're not a subscriber, leaving a comment, and sharing the video, it would be much appreciated. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.